Ah, Connecticut, bedroom community for Boston and New York. Its glory days long behind it. There was a time when Connecticut was the leading manufacturing state in the United States. It started with Eli Whitney of Hamden, Connecticut, who created the cotton gin and then designed the concept of mass production. And the next thing you knew, Connecticut exploded in industry to a point where every tree in the state was felled, either for firewood, for construction, or for manufacturing. The list of companies and manufacturers that existed in Connecticut are amazing to behold. Most understand that Hartford, Connecticut was once the insurance capital of the world, but did you know that Bigelow Tea Company, Colt Defense, Duracell, ESPN, and General Dynamics Electric Boat are all located and headquartered in Connecticut? How about Gerber Scientific, Newman's own Paul Newman's charitable company? Otis Elevator Company, you probably rode in an Otis elevator recently. Pepperidge Farm remembers it's in Connecticut. Pratt Whitney, Sikorsky Aircraft, Stanley Black & Decker. Doctors Group owns Subway sandwich shops. Waterbury Clock Company became Timex. And of course the WWE are all headquartered in Connecticut. But while the headquarters remain in Connecticut, what isn't is the manufacturing. You can't go into a town in Connecticut without finding an abandoned, decaying, decrepit factory that once employed hundreds, if not thousands, before those jobs were shipped to less expensive states before finally ending up overseas. And with the closing of the factories came a rise in crime and poverty. And now what were once economic centers thriving with industry are abandoned, decaying cities. While Connecticut still has the Gold Coast, the area of wealthy elites who have jobs in New York but choose to live in Connecticut countryside, Connecticut also has two of the most impoverished cities in the United States. Bridgeport, Waterbury, Hartford, New Haven, and New London are devastated by the impacts of that poverty. And with poverty comes crime and drugs. Wallingford, Connecticut, at one time was known as the cocaine gateway to New England. New Haven Port is an active port at one time rivaling New York. It is part of the National Oil Reserve Network and has two rivers that flow into it. This allows drug smugglers to port in New Haven, offload illegal merchandise, where it can either go on 95 north or south towards Rhode Island or New York, 91, which bisects Connecticut and heads towards Springfield, Massachusetts. It can then go on to 90, heading to Boston or upstate New York. In addition, there is the Merritt Parkway, a smaller highway that runs from New York up through the center of the state. Along with its many side roads and smaller highways, any smuggler, once they hit New Haven, has 100 different routes to get to Wallingford. Wallingford has a large amount of abandoned, decaying factory areas that are perfect for hiding illegal and illicit activity. What's so striking in contrast is that right up the hill from this abandoned industrial area is Choate Rosemary Hall, the most elite private high school on the planet. But our tale today does not take place directly in Wallingford. It takes place in Meriden, Connecticut, a very small town next to Wallingford. But understanding Wallingford's role in cocaine processing is critical to understanding why our tale is so tragic. Where crime and drugs begin to rise up, so do the people who want to profit from it. And one of the organizations that profits very well are motorcycle clubs, such as the Hells Angels. These new groups were enamored with that image of drugs, sex, and violence. One such group were the Diablos of Meriden, Connecticut.
You talk about motorcycle gangs, or clubs as they like to be called. Very few people probably know anything about the Diablos. Because while the Diablos were a national group, they never had more than 10 states in which they had clubhouses. One was in Springfield, one was in Meriden, one was in Indiana, and 2 or 3 were out in California. They were basically contemporaries of probably America's greatest known motorcycle gang, the Hells Angels. They had a kind of folklorish appeal to a lot of people in Meriden and around the state. For all the times law enforcement came up and said, these guys are hardened criminals, they're thieves, they're murderers, whatever it is, you could come up with people who were hangers on to the group, associates, actual, who described them as good people. They had dealt in stolen cars. There were homicides tied to them, and they really got taken down as a group in a sting operation that the federal government pulled on them, that the FBI, state police, ATF, all these different organizations pulled on them, in which a gang member who was about 6 feet tall, not a gang member, an associate, somebody who came from out of state, who was not a member of the Diablos, but got connected to them, joined them, who was about six foot something and 350 pounds, that everybody called Tiny. Tiny came to them in the 1990s and said, I have a deal. I want to get you guys a whole bunch of heroin. And according to the federal prosecutors, the Diablos went for it, and that's where our story begins.
Well, now, were the Diablos involved in drug dealing prior to that? Because you said they did cars, chop shop, and then murder. So
rumor, but at the same time, there were never that many arrests, and there were never any really big arrests. They seemed to be around, but nobody ever quite knew what exactly they did. They maintained they did nothing illegal. They just hung around with their motorcycles, and they had their parties. There were fights. There were brawls in the neighborhood on occasion. There was, just before the federal bust that I talked about, that I just mentioned, there were a couple of incidents where they got into fights with a splinter group, a group of people who broke off from them called the James Gang that settled in. And there was one homicide tied to that, 2 other homicides that the Diablos some Diablos members ended up getting convicted for, that happened on Route 15.
But I just want to carve out for people listening that there's a difference between 2 gangs going after each other, someone pisses or disrespects someone off and they end up dead, versus some motorcycle gangs are involved in murder for hire. You can go to some gangs and say, I need X person dead, here's $100,000. So when you talk about the homicides on the Diablos, they were not a murder for hire motorcycle gang. They didn't get involved in that. They were
at least so they were never charged,
right?
Which I think is an important distinction to make, because like a lot of these groups, they have a reputation that hangs over them for a lot of stuff that might or might not be true.
Right.
And one of the things that makes it interesting is they very much cultivate this ambiguity. There's always, around most any criminal enterprise, there is a kind of Robin Hood mentality. They are there to help people. The Hells Angels had this. The Hells Angels, when they weren't committing crime, were known for helping stranded motorists.
No,
that was one of the things that they used to do a lot of. They did fundraisers for police. They did fundraisers for other groups.
They did.
And you have to say that in the city of Meriden, the Diablos were known as a group among their neighborhood as being essentially harmless, maybe threatening in appearance. But there weren't that many crimes that they got tied to. There weren't that many activities that anybody really arrested them for. And their presence kind of cast a pall over the area. When I started dealing with them, it was in 1993. And the Diablos were involved with a small splinter group called the James Gang. The James Gang were in an area of Connecticut called Yalesville. And the Diablos dominated Meriden, which is a much larger area right next door.
But this area, while smaller, was critical because it cut the Diablos' access off to Wallingford and the drug suppliers there.
In 1992, 2 guys, last names DiGregorio and Hodge, were blown away after leaving a concert on the Berlin Turnpike. They were killed in Wallingford on an exit off of Route 15 or the Wilbercross Parkway. That was a homicide in 1992. There was another
homicide. That a suspected homicide by the Diablos?
Some members were eventually convicted of conspiracy to commit.
Okay. In the Route 15 post-concert.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were 2 people who were killed there. A third person was wounded. And then there was another homicide involving a guy named Michael D'Amato, who was a member of the James gang. So you had two things going on here. You had first the two homicides, supposedly because at least one of the people who was killed on Route 15 was dealing drugs at a concert on the Berlin Turnpike, which is in the city of Berlin. And supposedly they ran afoul of the members of the Diablos and they got killed.
At the concert?
After the concert, driving home on their motorcycles, they got off an exit on Route 15. Their way forward was blocked, and they were shot from behind.
But what was the ran afoul with the Diablos? Was it because they were dealing drugs in Diablo territory, or?
That was the story. And I'm being careful in how I'm describing this because none of this was ever terribly well proven in court. Like I said, the best charge they ever got anybody on was conspiracy to commit homicide.
Got it.
They didn't actually get them for actual homicide. So for the actual homicide, it was conspiracy to commit homicide in the case of DiGregorio and Hodge.
Okay.
And that didn't actually, that's as far as that one went. By rumor, there were like a half a dozen members who were involved. By rumor, they were using radios to communicate as they tracked, two-way radios, as they tracked these guys from Berlin along the highway down to Route 15 to Wallingford. And there it went. And then there was another homicide in 1992 connected with a separate but sort of separate but ongoing dispute between a smaller group called the James Gang,
which is a splinter group from the Diablos.
A splinter group from the Diablos. So you have a really kind of interesting dynamic of, on one hand, a community that runs the extremes to the button-down preppiness of Choate Rosemary Hall to contract hits or hits being carried out on members of criminal organizations, or which is Jack Baltus is out of town.
Of course.
Because he's in the hospital, I believe.
Oh, that's legitimate.
That's later. And you had a bizarre circumstance where these two guys walk into the bar. They get into a kind of mouthy conversation with the bartender. Somebody runs out of the bar to the Diablos clubhouse.
Oh no.
And you can hear he comes.
Yep.
4 or 5 members of, I believe it was 4 members of the Diablos, armed with guns, go running toward the bar.
Okay.
Now the two guys come up to an intersection.
So hold on. So they left the bar.
They left the bar.
So
they go to an intersection between where Grove Street tees up to another street.
Okay.
They go running over the hill.
With the Diablos in hot pursuit.
Chased from the bar. The Diablos start after them.
Okay.
But the two guys run into 4 members of the Meriden Police Department's narcotics unit, street narcotics unit.
Okay.
4 of them. The 2 guys chased from the bar say, "Hey, we're getting chased by these 4 guys with guns."
Okay.
The 4 cops top the hill, and pretty soon they're in a standoff with 4 of the members of the Diablos gang.
Okay.
One of the detectives, the detective sergeant running the unit at the time, shoots 4 times at a member of the Diablos, a guy named Raymond Stone.
Okay.
And the bullets hit around Raymond's leather jacket as Raymond is carrying his gun very carefully and dropping it on the opposite side of a fence. None of the Diablos were hit, but they were all charged.
The Diablos were charged.
Murder. The Diablos were charged.
Okay.
Because they came after the 2 guys in the bar with
guns.
Yep. And they got into a shootout with the police. I think that the 3 homicides in 1992-93, D'Amato, DiGregorio, and Hodge, plus the shooting incident in which Legier was involved, spurred one of the federal prosecutors alleged that one of the guys that was shot at, Nino, he was called Nino, said, "We got to get rid of Legier." Legier being the detective sergeant who ran the narcotics unit who shot at the police. It turned out he said that to the informant that the federal government had put in.
Nino said that to the federal. Great. Okay.
So yeah. So it was really a bizarre confluence of events.
Right.
And the whole bunch of them end up getting arrested. The first awareness anybody in media had, I think, that all of this was going on was a dispatch that came over the police radio saying, calling to a patrol car saying, neighbors are calling from around the clubhouse. They're saying that there's a large state police presence there. The local police, Meriden police, had no knowledge that anything was going on.
Okay.
When some patrol officers from the Meriden Police Department pull up near the clubhouse, they see almost a dozen state police cars marked and unmarked. From that, they went on like a 2-day sweep of arresting Diablos all over the place. And I think as many as 16 got arrested initially.
So sequentially, this was a result of Tiny coming down and saying, "I've got heroin." That's really initiated this. This is a heroin bust.
And overhearing Bertoldo saying, "These guys got to go."
Okay.
Legier's got to go. He was told, and he did have to. They did assign police officers were assigned to Legier's home.
Okay.
To guard him and his family.
When was that at contemporaneous of the admission to Tiny, or was that later on?
That was after the statement was made. Again, because it was said to an informant, the relay of information was fairly quick, and within a very short period of time after that, Legier had a police officer stationed at his house. Soon after that, that's when the sham deal came up. And that's when the sham heroin deal came up. All the Diablos got arrested.
Okay.
And it was it was such a strange time because, again, it was something that, you knew the Diablos were there. We knew that everybody knew that there was some kind of a dispute going on between them and the James gang.
Right.
There had been shooting incidents where shots were fired between groups of people. The police would find evidence. One time they found a guy who had actually gotten a finger shot off. He was a member of the Diablos.
Okay.
And there were incidents, but nothing really flared. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff happens, and it involves the targeting of an officer in good standing in his department for almost 20 years ago.
Well, so it sounds like to me that it was just normal motorcycle gang stuff. It was, they're having a dust up with another gang. They're involved in violence or shooting, whatever else. It's between them, not our world, not involving us. We don't care. And it wasn't. Now, had they been involved? Did they ever come up in heroin before? Were they acting as a distributor, or were they planning on dealing directly?
Not that I can recall, were they ever, not in recent, like 10 years before, were they caught doing any great amount of dealing. And that was one of the arguments made by the defense. The defense basically portrayed the Diablos as being something more like the gang who couldn't shoot straight, and tried to imply that the only reason this happened was because a guy who was a rat for hire, pitched them a deal and said that this stuff was going on and said that this was happening. And it was audio recorded. So it really didn't have, it was audio recorded. So it wasn't like they could truly deny that what happened.
That raises an entrapment question, which is
right.
Always interesting to me. And just for the folks listening, entrapment, in case you don't know.
Right.
Is a situation where you didn't think of committing the crime. You didn't plan on committing the crime. You were just going about your day, just regular, right as rain, and then all of a sudden someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, do you want to commit a crime?" Now, I guess it could legitimately happen, but 9 times out of 10, it may be a cop. So it comes up, for instance, in online child porn stings, where if you're just floating along and just being on the internet, and all of a sudden this person claiming to be a 12-year-old girl reaches out and contacts you and says, "Hey, do you want a good time?" That's entrapment, because you didn't go looking for it. They came and found you, and then it creates a whole other host of issues with regards to fruit of the poisonous vine kind of situation. So it does raise a question when someone walks into the clubhouse and says, "Hey, I got 40 pounds of heroin. Who wants to party?"
Right.
It clearly didn't rise to the level of entrapment because they got prosecuted for it. And entrapment is an affirmative defense. So yeah. So yeah, you kind of see, well, some random guy comes off the street and is like, "I got heroin." Right. On the other hand, if you've got 40 pounds of heroin and want to offload it, motorcycle gang could be a natural thought. Like, oh, well, where else am I going to go with it? Did you see the story for the gym teacher and the Mexican cartel?
Nuh-uh.
Down in North Carolina is a massive drug highway into the United States. It's major. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the Mexican cartels actually have stash and safe houses in North Carolina along the highway. And somehow, this high school gym teacher happened to know where one of the stash houses was and happened to know that a delivery was about to take place. So he body armors up, gets some weapons, gets a friend of his with some weapons, and they go out and they meet the delivery guy at the stash house. Now, details are a little spotty to me. I've seen a couple articles on it. But essentially, at the end of the day, the 18-year-old drug mule, they hogtied him, put him in the front yard, shot him in the head. Now, so any hope that you're going to have any sympathy at all just went right out the door that this high school, gym teacher took 2 rounds in the back of an 18-year-old's head.
Right.
He had the owner of the house was someone else was there, came upon it, whatever. They got into a shootout. Gym teacher gets shot and killed. There were 20 kilos of cocaine and $8,000, I think. And that was the question that came up was, okay, you get 20 kilos of coke. What do you do with it?
Yeah.
Like your average person has that's not personal use. Let's be real clear. Unless you're suicidal, entertain the entire neighborhood. But no, I mean, your average person's not going to know, what do I do with 20 kilos of cocaine? Right. So that raises kind of an interesting question, which is, well, there's a Hell's Angel group down the street. They may not deal in coke, but I'm willing to bet they know someone that does. And for a cut, they'll hook me up. So it is almost that kind of suspicion of, someone walks in because they know the Diablos and they're like, "Hey guys, I got, heroin, I got to move. Right. You guys want to do it?" Which means that, again, there had to be some kind of pre-existing.
Yeah. Oh, and Mike, I have to tell you something right now. I screwed up. It's not heroin. It was cocaine.
Oh, was it coke? Oh, okay.
The actual amount was 20 kilos cocaine that was supposed to be brought to a Massachusetts airport. It was an FBI sting operation.
I should have known that was bullshit immediately. Coke moves up from New Haven Harbor, not from a mass airport. That makes me suspicious that they don't know, they weren't moving drugs, that they didn't know that.
But the reason was, and this is an interesting thing, was in Massachusetts, a grand jury is a hell of a lot easier, was at the time anyway, a hell of a lot easier to convene than it was in Connecticut.
They were forum shopping. The other reason, well, no, but keep in mind, the other reason is that unless it's over a state line, FBI can't be involved.
That's exactly it, too.
So, some guy walks in, 20 kilos of cocaine, it's landing at an airport in Massachusetts, come with me. It's like, and again,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
As I pointed out, Wallingford was the cocaine processing capital of New England. So if the Diablos were actually involved in coke dealing at any point, they would have known that, like, I can go next door and get 20 kilos. Why do I got to go to Massachusetts? They're going to go all to Massachusetts to get 20 kilos of coke. Like,
right.
What the hell are you going to make me drive all that way?
The most interesting thing, too, was during this whole situation, when they were going before or immediately after to pick up the ersatz cocaine, they came upon an FBI van and they saw the recording equipment within it.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So they're literally staring at the camera going, "What's that doing here?"
Uh-huh. And at no point thought, maybe we should not be doing this. This is a little suspicious.
It was just something where it was really like the motorcycle. They were really basically the motorcycle gang who couldn't shoot straight. And
well, it's funny because that was always.
Have to be careful. Now I have to be careful saying that because in fact there's 3 homicides involved here.
Well, but
so
I
clearly
think the
somebody
image was what they were putting out. But the reality is, I mean, that was kind of the understanding, I think, around Connecticut was Diablos were they were a local Meriden group.
Yeah. And there was an air of unreality to the thing insofar into the trial, because while it was a very serious thing, that you come away saying that aside from these homicides, again, 3 homicides, that's not a small thing. There really wasn't that much illegal activity going on here that they ever got caught for, if they were doing anything at all. So it was a very strange time, because it was hard to look at it in terms of absolute black and white.
I mean, what you're essentially talking about is really just a group or gang of guys that, you know, had learning disabilities, not a lot of education, that were down to earth. They, you know, mechanics, they like riding their bikes, they're all hanging out together. They had attitude problems and maybe some anger management issues. But it's like, all right, so, you know, what group of guys don't we know like that? You know,
the funny thing was,
there's kind of like Masons on motorcycles, although the Masons have their own Widow Sons motorcycle group. But you know what I'm saying? They're kind of like, you know, outside. They're like Masons on motorcycle. Like they just have a club.
They were really. Yeah. I had one situation with Jack Baltus where I kind of got a glimmer of what was going on. Jack Baltus, when you got to know him a little bit, was a charismatic individual, very big, beefy guy, very heavy set, kind of heavy, fat, but muscular too. And he carried himself with his shoulders thrown back. He was the kind of person where he could see leadership is leadership in any organization. And he had a kind of interesting charisma to him. He could be charming. He could be funny. He could be crude. And he could be on occasion threatening. It really depended on what you were doing. And he was very watchful and very controlled. He wasn't somebody who flew off the handle. If anything, by rumor, Jack was the guy. When the Diablos ever got arrested for anything, usually Jack wasn't around. Okay. Because the rumor was that the rumor, and I think the reality was that he kept people in line, because he was being investigated again in 92, 93 for the 3 homicides.
Right.
And state police were occasionally a visible presence in that neighborhood. At about this time, the Diablos doubled the cameras they had on the outside of their clubhouse, the surveillance system. And like I said, if you came into the neighborhood and you weren't a member of the neighborhood, Baltus had, whether it was the cameras around the clubhouse or other places or just people telling him, he knew who was in the neighborhood and who wasn't, and who belonged in the neighborhood, who wasn't. And I'm talking like a 2 or 3 block area.
So what was the aftermath? So they had an informant, they had evidence, they had a grand jury in Massachusetts. They bring him in federal court. They try him.
Was that all but 2 of them were found. There was a half dozen that were charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine, conspiracy to distribute drugs, and other things.
Right.
And 2 of them were found not guilty. And Jack Baltus went away and did about 10 years and died. Went away, did about 10, 15 years and died. He was charged with, the leader of the gang was charged with conspiracy to possess and distribute heroin. He was sentenced.
Or was it heroin?
It was heroin in one instance, cocaine in another.
Okay, so there were other drugs involved. This was not just
involved. All right. And basically, it was a case of, and he got released from prison, and he died of a heart attack within about a year.
Oh wow.
So it was a really melancholic thing.
So when Jack Baltus went away, what happened to the Diablos then? At that point, did they just collapse?
They eventually moved out of Meriden altogether, and today the clubhouse is closed.